Welcome everybody in person, welcome everybody online. It is a delight to be able to introduce my colleagues, and I want to introduce them to sort of help you understand where they come from and how they're approaching the work. Kelly Wisecup is the Arthur E. Anderson Teaching and Research Professor in the Department of English at Northwestern University, where she is also affiliated with the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. She is a settler scholar who works with contemporary Native nations and people to research, teach, and write about Indigenous literatures. She is the author of several books, including most recently, Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilation, and the Archives of Early Native American Literature, published by Yale University Press in 2021. This book was awarded the 2023 Early American Literature Book Prize and the 2023 St. Louis Mercantile Library Prize from the Bibliographical Society of America. Kelly is currently working on a new project, which is a collaborative digital edition of the manuscript magazine made by the Ojibwe poet Jane Johnston Schoolcraft and her family, a project that was supported in its early stages by the Newberry Library, which gave me wonderful access and connection to seeing Kelly here in the hallways. Dr. Rose Miron is the director of the D'Arcy McNickle Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library, a position she began in 2019. She has been an affiliate faculty member at the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University since 2021. Aside from the work we're going to talk about tonight through Kelly's questions and the conversation, Rose has published on methods and archival practice around Indigenous history in various scholarly journals and publications. But Rose engages public audiences too, and this engagement defines her mission as a historian. You may have read her piece, "The Story of Chicago's Founding Erases Centuries of Contributions from Indigenous People," in the Chicago Tribune in November of 2023. She was recently an invited speaker at the American Writers Festival, and she was in conversation on the topic of Indigenous history and memory. She was a contributor recently to WTTW's Chicago Mystery Series on The Place of Wild Onion, Where Does Chicago Get Its Name? And she has worked and continues to work with tribal nations to advance policies and practices that help them access and shape narratives about their histories. Indigenous archival activism is the outcome of so much of this training and work, and it is just a delight to be here, and I'm excited to listen. The other thing I want to say, Kelly and Rose are talking tonight, but the talking comes after long periods of silence, after a period of asking deep questions, after immersion in collections, after a period of deep listening and reflection to what the collections told you or didn't tell you. They are model scholars in their methods and approaches to Indigenous research. They are both dedicated to posing hard questions about who has the right to collect and represent Native American history. And they are scholars, importantly, who have committed to dialogue and dissemination, to sharing what they have learned in the archives with curious learners of all types who want to advance their knowledge about Indigenous histories. And they've been a team. They just team taught a course at Northwestern. And also, I just want to say in closing, they're the type of people that when you run into them at the Newberry and you start talking to them about their work, you do not want the conversation to stop. You have to get to a meeting, but you think, I need this to continue. Let's have coffee. So I have been the beneficiary of many starter conversations with them, and I want to turn the microphone over to them so they can continue that conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Laura. It's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight, Rose, talking about your book. As Laura said, we're talking tonight, but it really is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of conversations that I feel like I've been lucky to have with Rose about working in archives, about connecting, trying to connect with Indigenous communities around archival materials, and around this book. I was lucky enough to read a draft of the book in its early stages, and we just taught a couple of chapters in the class that we just taught. at Northwestern. So I'm happy to continue that conversation tonight. So I wanted to start by just asking you to talk a little bit about the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, the subjects and your collaborators in this book. What does the audience tonight need to know about that nation in order to understand the book?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Likewise, Kelly, I'm just excited to continue conversations with you. So yeah, I want to start a little bit by just talking about Stockbridge-Munsee history. So Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican people, their ancestral homelands are on the East Coast, across this kind of yellow area here, which is known to them as the Mohicanatuck, but known to us today as the Hudson River Valley. And Mohican and Munsee people are technically two different tribal communities. They've always been relatives, but they are two distinct nations. And something that kind of brought them together in their early years was the acceptance of a Christian mission at the town that is now known as Stockbridge in western Massachusetts, which is also marked on that map. So in 1734, Mohican leadership decided to have a Christian mission be established in Stockbridge, which was, to them, Winnetocook, which was already a village site of theirs. And they made this decision, they debated it and they decided like whether it would be the right thing for their nation, but ultimately they decided that they wanted their children to learn English and they wanted to at least somewhat work with some of these new settlers as a way forward. So they accepted that mission. Some Munsee people were at Stockbridge as well. But unfortunately, as soon as 1783, they were forced to leave their homelands. Over the course of 7 different removals, which are shown on this poster, which is something that was created by the tribe, their reservation is now in central Wisconsin. And so you can see you can see it on the map up there. And I think, what I just want to emphasize more than anything is just that this is a community that has gone through an incredible amount of strife. And I think like their removal from their homelands has really made an impact on how they tell their history today. And I think so much of the book is trying to think about how they reconnect to those places.
Thanks. As we think about, and I have a couple questions about this in a minute, as we think about how the nation tells their history, I wanted to maybe do a little bit of scene setting. And for me, one of the immediate things that the book does is set the scene with the cover photo. And I know that you have a slide of it as well. And I love so much about this photo. There's the poster of Sitting Bull. There's the document titled "This is Our Land" in the bottom right-hand corner. I think that's right. Yeah. Okay, I'm like doing the flippy thing. There's a variety of ages of people in the photo as well. Could you help us understand what's happening here, who we see here, why is this scene important?
Yeah, absolutely. So this group of women are some of the founding members of what is the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Historical Committee. And the Historical Committee is really sort of the main player in the book. I should have said when we were talking a little bit about Stockbridge-Munsee history that the community has long had a method for recording their history and passing it on to future generations. This is documented in several different sources across several centuries, that there was somebody designated in the community who was a rememberer who would tell the stories of their community to future generations. And so that role was taken up by multiple people throughout history, and eventually those stories were written down by people like Hendrik Oppenpot and John Quinney. But there's a big shift in the 20th century, and actually when the collecting of physical archival materials begins in the 1930s, when the tribe is trying to reorganize under the Indian Reorganization Act, and they're required to pull together all of this documentation to essentially justify their existence to the US government. And so as they are doing that, 2 people, Arvid and Bernice Miller, who are married, become kind of the people who are collecting all of these materials in their home. Bernice is second from the left here in the kind of patterned blouse. And her husband, Arvid, was tribal chairman for a number of years, and so he was traveling across the United States, and everywhere that he would go, he would make copies of materials. Most of that was done before the copy machine or scanners were readily available, and so a lot of the early records of the archive are his handwritten transcriptions that he, went to the National Archives and was like handwriting and transcribing these materials and then bringing back them to the reservation, and then Bernice was archiving them. And so in 1968, Arvid passed away. And shortly thereafter, there was a fire in Bernice's home that nearly destroyed all of these records that they had been collecting for the last 30 years. And neighbors, including some of the women in this picture, actually rushed into the house and carried out these documents, saving them from the fire. And it was really that kind of literal spark that spurred this group of women to come together and to create the Stockbridge-Munsee Historical Committee, and really take up this work that Arvid had been doing, that Bernice had been doing, but really approach it as a group. And so most of these, like I said, I mean, these are all women, and I don't think that that is an accident, and I can say more about that if people are interested, maybe in the Q&A, but I think like Bernice and her sister Dorothy, who is the one who is standing kind of in the middle there, they were really the leaders of this effort, and essentially they just started collecting. They began planning trips, they began talking to people in their community, and they began bringing all of these pieces together to start creating a public tribal archive. So this picture was taken in the first building that the tribal archive was in. It was, I don't actually know who took it. I know that it was published in a newspaper, so it's very possible that it was sort of staged. But we can certainly see just like how vast the types of materials that they're looking at. And you know, as you said, I really love like the fact that Sitting Bull is on the wall and that there's this like "This is our land" poster, because I really think it speaks to the way that these women saw their work as activists, and they saw it as tied to many of the national movements that were happening in the same time. This is 1968, you know, so they really saw this as a move to recover and reclaim their history.
I want to just pick up on what you just said here, kind of linking the archive with the moment 1968, this moment of a lot of political activism and of civil rights movements around the US. You know, one of the things I was thinking of as I was rereading the book for tonight is that I think people may not always think of an archive when they think about activism. So I just taught an undergrad class on Indigenous literatures of protest, and a lot of our touch points were things like blockades and occupations, or direct actions like happened at Standing Rock in 2016 and elsewhere, of course. So, you know, maybe archives seem a little dusty or quiet compared to the kind of direct action that we think about when we maybe think about activism or protest. Could you say a little bit more about how you think about archives as activism in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I always start with is that I think there's a lot of people that don't necessarily realize that there are sort of like archive-related things happening as part of these larger protest movements. You know, if we think about the Red Power movement, like I think people often forget that the same moment that like the occupation of Alcatraz is happening and the March to Washington is happening, that this is the same moment that American Indian Studies departments are being founded across the country. This is when the D'Arcy McNickle Center was founded here at the Newberry, and it's also like there are things within those larger protest movements that have to do with education. I mean, like a school is set up at Alcatraz, and people are recognizing that like reteaching Native history in a way that centers Native voices is an important part of their activist movements. And so I think, ultimately, like that really tells us that people both then and now have a profound understanding that history matters in terms of, I think any activist movement, activists understand that people are missing something. They've been mistaught history. There's been history that's been actively erased. And that's why I think in so many cases, even in modern movements, we see things like a syllabus for Standing Rock, right? Like people recognize that there's something that's missing in the way that this history has been represented. And so I always I think that history and the way it's taught is such an important part of that conversation, and I think that anybody who has written history or even who has read history will understand that archives play such a huge role in the way that history is constructed. The framework that I use in my book is drawn from a scholar named Michel Roth-Trouillot, who talks about how archives are so important in the creation of sources, how those sources get assembled in archives, how they get accessed to create historical narratives, and then how those historical narratives ultimately shape our collective understanding of history. And so I really see the work of the historical committee as kind of intervening in each of those moments and ultimately changing the way that their history is constructed.
Thanks. I want to go back a little bit to a comment you made about Arvid and the ways that he would go to other archives and copy by hand documents related to the nation. I think as an archive nerd, one of the things that is cool about coming to an archive is getting to see the original document and the piece of paper that someone else hundreds of years ago sometimes touched or made or carried with them for a little while. But one of the things I really love about the book, and this story in particular, is the ways that actually copies become really important to the archive that the Mohican Nation is making. So could you talk a little bit about this practice of copying and reproducing and why it's so important to have the copies in this place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to pull up a map here that was created for the book. Each of these points represents an archive with Mohican materials. And as you can see, they are vastly spread out across the United States. There are clusters in Wisconsin where the tribe is now. There are clusters on the East Coast. But then we have records as far west as Utah and as far east as Virginia. And so there is the way that archival materials of Indigenous people have been scattered across the United States is really due to the way that people buy and sell archival materials. And that has made it incredibly difficult for tribes, including folks like Stockbridge-Munsee, to access so many of their materials. And so, when Arvid was doing that initial research, I think the initial goal was just to bring this information closer to his community, right? If people don't have that information accessible, they can't do the work to justify their existence to the federal government. They can't, make decisions about what information they do want to pass on that exists in these documents. And so I think, first of all, the primary goal was just purely access for community members to be able to have these materials near them, and so they could use them how they saw fit. And I think, we see that really clearly in how they do get used in the records. The records that he and others brought back ultimately get used in battles about the reservation boundaries. They get used in repatriation cases where the tribe is having to compile documentation about their connection to items that they're trying to repatriate. And they get used for community education and language revitalization. So there's really a vast way that community members are using this archive and tapping into the records. The other thing that I think bringing all these materials to this location does is it created the largest collection of Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican materials in the world. So if you are a scholar who is going to do research on Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican people, it would be foolish for you to not go there because virtually, almost everything that you could find is there. And that's why I did the majority of the research for this book at that tribal archive. And I think what that does is it forces scholars who are maybe not part of the community to interface directly with the community that they are writing about. You can't sit in that archive and not have people talk to you and ask you what you're working on. And that really, I think, fuels collaboration, and it allows the tribe to extend at least a little bit of control over the types of historical narratives that are being created. And ultimately, I think both of those things, access and the extension of sovereignty, is ultimately about who creates historical narratives and how, right? The access gives tribal members greater ability to create historical narratives as they see fit, and it allows the tribe to have more of an influence in the other historical narratives that are being created.
Thanks. This also makes me think this sort of move to regather maybe materials made by Mohican people or made about Mohican people and have them in the nation makes me think about place itself as an archive and place as really important to remembering history, as a site of memory, as a place that itself kind of bears the marks of histories. And it seems like this comes up in a couple of ways throughout the book. I'm thinking about the ways that the nation maintains a presence in its ancestral homelands. So there are trips that tribal members take to the places where their ancestors made their homes, and there's a kind of embodied knowledge that's made possible through those returns. There's the presence of a tribal historic preservation office in their ancestral homelands. So I'm thinking also about a story in the book where the tribe forced a Walmart to abandon plans to build a store that would have been over a burial ground in New York or in Massachusetts, New York,
yeah.
Because it had those that presence in their ancestral homelands. So could you kind of talk us through some of the ways that Mohican people have used archives and used place as an archive to maintain connections and a relationship to a place from which they were forcibly evicted?
Yeah, so this is one of the first things that the Historical Committee does after they organize in 1968. They start planning trips back to their ancestral homelands. And initially these trips are relatively small, and they're primarily based on wanting to go to additional archives and make copies of materials. But I'd say by the early 1970s, they explode into like these bus trips in which like they are bringing like, you know, dozens of people on coach buses, or not coach, like any kind of bus, out to their ancestral homelands, and they are coordinating these sort of tours for tribal members through their ancestral homelands, stopping at significant places. And it's really clear from both talking to people and in the archive itself that the archive was used to create these itineraries. So, you know, the historical committee members are doing research on different places. They're pulling like excerpts from primary documents that they can then share with people who are on these trips. And they begin to essentially create these tours as a way to re-educate folks about their history. Certainly there are like varying levels of knowledge within the community about tribal history. A lot of this knowledge, of course, has been passed on orally, but the historical committee's goal was always really to just make sure that not only were people able to like learn their history, but also learn it in the place where it happened. You know, they're very deliberate about bringing people to these places that are sacred to them, that are important, and about taking part in practices that allow them to kind of reconnect with these places and this landscape. And so that becomes a really big part of also just kind of shaping a collective identity for the nation. And so, you know, I think with all of the removals and boarding schools and all of these things that had happened that had tried to further fracture the nation, these trips are ultimately about cultivating a shared sense of memory, a shared sense of history among tribal members.
Thanks. So building a little bit on that shared sense of memory and identity, there's also a case in which the Historical Committee used archival records to advocate for the return of some belongings that were stolen from the tribe, a 2-volume Bible set, for some reason that's harder to say than it was to write, that was stolen from the tribe in the 1930s. And the tribe is working on trying to bring about the return of these materials before the federal government has some pathways for tribes to bring home materials from federally funded institutions to their tribal nation. So how did these Bibles end up away from the tribal nation, and how did the tribal nation manage to get them back?
Yeah, I do have an image of these. So this 2-volume Bible set was given to the tribe in 1734 when they had accepted this mission at Stockbridge. It was actually a gift from the chaplain to the Prince of Wales. And so they're given these Bibles as sort of a token of like, you know, Christian missionization. But when they are removed, the tribe carries them with them. They build this like oak chest for the Bibles, and they carry them with them throughout this extensive removal that you saw the map of earlier. And then somebody in the tribe was responsible for taking care of these Bibles for many years. However, in 1929, the person who was responsible for taking care of them passed away, and his wife was caring for the Bibles in their home. And a local religious leader who was working with the tribe actually went into their home when she was gone and stole these Bibles, claiming them for the church that he was representing, and then ultimately selling them to a white collector on the East Coast. That white collector's name was Mabel Choate, and she was compiling materials to create a museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where the Bibles had originally been gifted. There's all this very interesting correspondence that I don't have time to go into today, but you know, she kind of talked about how these would be like the crown jewel of her collection, and she had been like working with Westphal, who's the religious leader who stole the Bibles in the first place, to like acquire lots of materials over probably 2 years, and ultimately this was sort of her goal all along, was to get these. So they end up in this museum in Western Massachusetts, and once the tribe discovers that they are there, in 1975, they decide to ask for them back and ask them to be returned. This is well before the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, is passed, so there's really no precedence for this kind of return from museums to tribes like there is today. This goes on for almost 30 years. There's a huge back and forth between the tribe and the museum, and they're continuing to try to get these materials back. And ultimately, the tribe and really the historical committee initiated what became like a public campaign where they created 2 different booklets of materials related to the theft of the Bibles and all of like their correspondence with the museum, and they published them and shared them across the nation and encouraged people to basically inundate the organization that was holding them with letters and phone calls, which people did. And so again, ultimately, like they are using primary sources from the 18th century and making copies of them and then reprinting them in these booklets that are circulating the nation. And ultimately, the public campaign does, as well as the sort of timing of NAGPRA, the beginning of debates about NAGPRA, ultimately pushes the museum to give in, and they repatriate the Bibles in 1990, just before the passage of NAGPRA. The communion set, which is on the right here in the photo, wasn't actually repatriated until 2005, and that was under NAGPRA. It's a longer story for another day, but yeah.
Well, the stories you've been telling give us a rich sense of the ways that the Historical Committee and the tribe more broadly have used archives in really compelling and creative ways to remember their own histories, to insist on the respect of those histories from non-Native peoples. I want to ask a question that's a little zoomed out, to ask about a couple of key terms that are in the book and also are really important in Indigenous studies. And those 2 terms are sovereignty and nationhood. So I'm curious how you think this case shows us how archives shape what nationhood looks like for the Mohican Nation, and what sovereignty looks like for the Mohican Nation. And I'm curious, too, how you think the tribe's understanding and experiences of those terms might challenge US-based understandings of something like what a nation is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that part of the reason that I ended up talking so much about nationhood is because of the way that settler colonial archives, as I call them in the book, are so tied to U.S. nationhood. I think as soon as the United States is founded as a nation, and even before that, people are collecting archival materials and using them to define the new nation state. Early people like Thomas Jefferson are encouraging people to go out and collect information about Indigenous people, and that information is being incorporated into these collections that are now in, like state archives today. And so I think that, and there's lots of scholarship, I should also say, that like ties archives to national identity. And so I think I was kind of coming at it from that and then thinking about like, okay, tribal archives are also national archives of tribal nations, but this process is very different, and the way that these archives are operating is very different, and that's part of what really led me into the project. And so ultimately, I think, when we think about how Indigenous information is collected in settler colonial archives, it's a very extractive process, right? It's often non-Native people who are going into communities, taking that information and storing it in archives in a way that is organized around non-Native people. It's usually organized around like the people who collected it. Tribal archives are more so a process of recovery and repiecing together information that has been scattered. And so I think that, there are 2 scholars that I leaned on fairly heavily in the book to think about nationhood, one of which is Lisa Brooks, who talks about the process of remembering and remembering. She has like a hyphen in between there. And she talks about these as like, the process of bringing information back together as a way of sort of stitching a nation that has been very fractured back together. And I think that's really a lot of what I saw in this process and why it was so influential to me in writing the book. The other scholar that I found really helpful in thinking about nationhood was Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice, who talks about nationhood as being woven from the dreams, ideas. I have his quote written here, but of course lives, dreams, challenges of the people who compose the body politic. And so I think what is so clear in the tribal archive and what has been so clear in the rest of the efforts that the historical committee has taken up is how important the people in their nation are, and we see that in how the archive is organized. We see it in how the actions that they take up move forward, and so so I really see it as this process of sort of redefining a nation that has had so much taken away from it through removal and through assimilation campaigns. And I think also, as I mentioned before, the archive just gives the tribe the ability to extend some additional control and sovereignty over how their history is constructed and how it's used. And so that was kind of why I ended up using those two terms so heavily.
Thanks. I want to turn us to talk a little bit about method and your method in writing the book. And before we talk about the sort of how, I guess I want to ask you a little bit about the structure of the book. And so one structure that I noticed as I was rereading it is that you move from projects that are by and for the Mohican Nation. So projects where Mohican people are reading the materials that have been assembled by other Mohican people and writing newspaper articles about them, or making indexes or catalogs so that other Mohican people can better access or more easily access the archives. So that's the kind of early part of the book. And then the later part of the book are maybe more interventions, the kind of intervening, rewriting sometimes explicitly what other settler archives or institutions or individuals are saying about Mohican people. So this might be curricula, this might be museum displays, but a kind of outward-facing kind of shift in how Mohican people are represented. So I'm curious about the arc, or that arc, and I had a couple of things I was thinking about here, and so I'm curious what you were thinking. But some of the things I was wondering is this like change over time? This is where I tend to sort of be a historian, but I'm not. But do we see a kind of shift in the strategies of archival activism over time? Is this a kind of sense of gathering the source space of materials and then shifting what's possible and what people are able to do with it? So I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. It's not change over time.
Okay.
I did a very non-historian thing here, and I intentionally organized these chapters thematically and not chronologically because you can see in the original goals that the historical committee drafted and the early grant applications that they're writing in the 1970s that they, from the beginning, recognized both the interest in making these materials accessible to their own community members and doing a lot of community-based education and revitalization, and also right away recognizing that they needed to correct all of these very strong misrepresentations that exist about their tribe. This is the tribe of James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, and so all Native nations face very strong erasure narratives, but they face extremely strong erasure narratives because of the book and ultimately the movie that suggests that the tribe no longer exists. And so, in those early materials that they're writing and creating, you see right away that they have both internal and external audiences in mind, and the activities that they take up right away have both of those audiences in mind. So, within the first couple of years, they are in local schools trying to change what is being taught in their local schools. They are in correspondence with different museums about different displays that they have, and yet they're also conducting oral histories, and they are also doing new cultural programs that they have created. So it's really I've always kind of described it as a constellation of activities because it's an incredibly vast amount of work and there's lots of different types of work that's happening, but they're all sort of connected. And I always kind of think about the archive as the nucleus from which all of this spread comes out of, and that connects all of it together.
I appreciate that, especially the kind of pushback against change against time when the erasure narratives of settler colonialism are continuing. Okay, so to turn us again toward method, I wanted to ask about your method. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is how it models how a scholar might be in long-term relationship with a tribal nation, and how a non-native scholar might be in long-term relationship with a tribal nation, such that the research reflects that relationship. In your intro, you talk about how the roots of this project go back to your undergraduate thesis. And then now, of course, it is a beautifully published book, and you're a practicing public historian here in your role at the Newberry Library. So I have two questions about your method, and I'll ask them one at a time. What has been your process as a scholar to work with and in the tribal archive?
Yeah, so I started working on this project in 2010, as Kelly mentioned, when I was an undergraduate. And I was introduced to a oral history project that the tribe was working on, and went to the reservation to view these like public showings of these oral history videos that had been created. And I think I grew up in Wisconsin, about an hour away from the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation, but I knew very little, if anything, about the tribe, in spite of state laws in Wisconsin that require that you learn tribal history in elementary and high school. And so I think I was profoundly struck by like my own ignorance, but also I very quickly realized that the tribe had a vested interest in telling new stories about their history. And so, you know, I started talking to people. I was invited to attend a historical committee meeting, and I essentially just like started having conversations with historical committee members. And it was really through those conversations that we sort of came to the idea of a project that would document the work that the historical committee had done. There have been other books written about Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican history, but there had not been anything that had really documented the work of these women. And the women on the committee were really invested in that story being told. And so I would say, you know, from the beginning, the project was really led by tribal priorities, and then it really became an iterative process in which I was continually traveling between the reservation and Minneapolis, where I went to graduate school, and you know, continually being in conversation with these community members. So I think, you know, that's the first thing, is that it was like an iterative process in which I felt like I was being consistently led by tribal priorities. I think like just a couple of other things that stick out to me about the way that I have tried to approach the project. You know, one, I think I always wanted to recognize that I was a guest in the space, and I really wanted to prioritize tribal sovereignty above anything else. So, you know, I really wanted to make sure that like any publication that came out of this was approved by both the historical committee and the tribal council. And I worked very closely with the legal department when it came to the actual oral histories for the book, which, you know, we created sort of new forms waiving my copyright for those oral histories. We worked together on those. I also just think like I made some decisions about things that I didn't include in the book, not because I wanted to whitewash what was going on, but just because I recognized that my role was a guest and that I had been invited into spaces in which trust was being extended to me about what information was appropriate to share and what wasn't. And so I made decisions like that based on what I thought were my responsibilities. I think also just trying to approach it like humbly and recognizing that like I'm actually not the expert here. You know, I'm doing research in the archive, but I mean, I can't tell you how many times I would work on something and write something up and then show it to the historical committee, and they would be like, oh, you're missing, you know, this thing. And I would rewrite it based on, you know, conversations that we had. And there are so many times in the book itself where the citation is a conversation with a community member rather than something I found in an archival document, because there's just a lot of knowledge that exists outside of archives. And then I think finally, I really wanted to make sure that there were, the historical committee was invested in the book being written, and so that was great. But I also wanted to make sure that the tribe was receiving like tangible benefits from the book. So, you know, I tried, as I did some archival trips to other places, to work with them to like copy materials and bring them back so that I could also take part in sort of like building out the tribal archive. And then also just doing things like, you know, making sure that all of the royalties from the book go to the tribe, and that it's not like a thing that I am making money off of. So I think just trying to, it's a lot of small things, I guess, but trying to set up those things to create what I think has been a very reciprocal relationship.
Thanks. So the other piece of this question that I want to ask has to do with how your position at the Newberry shapes how you think about working with and in Indigenous archives, and how working with and in tribal archives has shaped your work at the Newberry.
Yeah, I'm going to take the second one of those first, how tribal archives have influenced my work at the Newberry. I think working on this book profoundly impacted my decision to apply for and ultimately to accept this job. I sort of had a front row seat to the many barriers that tribes continue to face as they try to access archival materials as part of whatever kind of work that they are doing. And so I saw the opportunity to apply for this job as a chance to work from within an institution to make that access easier. I had seen a lot of the barriers firsthand. I was familiar with a lot of the challenges, and so I felt like I had the opportunity to work within an institution and try to break down some of those things. I will say I also, between graduate school and working here, I also worked for the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, where I was working on trying to create a digital archive of boarding school records, which has now launched. And so I think that experience also really opened my eyes to, again, like how many barriers people face in trying to find information about their relatives. And so, and I think we have done a lot of that stuff at the Newberry. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, but I think, I'm really happy with some of the revisions that we've made related to how we handle culturally sensitive materials, some of the critical cataloging work that we're doing. There's an article in the Newberry magazine, the most recent Newberry magazine, about some of that cataloging work if you're interested in learning more about that. And then I'll just say, in terms of like how my work here influenced tribal archives or my work in tribal archives, I think just working here made me realize how much of a role institutions like the Newberry do have to play in the process of tribes being able to recover their materials and reassemble their own archives. And I think the Newberry can still certainly serve as a repository for some collections. There are some collections that don't neatly fit into tribal archives. Materials that refer to multiple tribal nations, things like that. Like I think the Newberry still has an important role to play in the collection of information about Native people. But I fundamentally believe that tribes are the best representatives of their own history. And so I think, working here has just allowed me to see what role I think larger institutions can play in this. And that's really what drove me to write the conclusion of the book the way I did, which is really directed at people who work in large institutions like the Newberry.
Thanks. We're heading toward Q&A, so I want to ask one last question, and until you all can ask your questions. And that's, if folks would like to learn more about Stockbridge-Munsee or read more about the nation, are there resources you would recommend folks seek out?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican tribal website is the best place to start. If you Google Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, it will be the first thing that comes up. On there you can find a number of resources, but I'll just call out a couple. One is a PDF of a source that I relied on heavily and I always point people to. It's called A Brief History of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation by Dorothy Davids. Dorothy Davids was one of the original founders of the historical committee, and this is sort of like, it's her telling of Stockbridge-Munsee history. So I always point people to that as like a first source for like overall Stockbridge-Munsee history. The Cultural Affairs Department, which is sort of the outgrowth of the Historical Committee, has a page on the website, and they have both a resource and like an FAQ sheet. So if folks are interested in that, that's a great place to start. There are also several videos of tribal members talking about their history on that site. And there's a couple links to things, but I'll just call out one. In Stockbridge, the tribe has now created a walking tour of Stockbridge, and it's like a bunch of videos of tribal members who are descendants of people who were deeded land in Stockbridge, talking about their connection to that place. If you happen to be in Western Massachusetts, I certainly recommend that you do it in person, but it's also available online, so you can watch the entire thing online, and I just think it's an amazing example of an intervention in public history. And then finally, I'll just say the Mohican Writers Group, which is a group of tribal members who get together and produce writing, just recently published a volume called Along the Many Trails, a Journal of Contemporary Literature by the Mohican people, and you can buy that, most places that books are sold, so I always encourage people to look at that.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, formally and otherwise. We'll now turn things over to questions from you all. Thank you. Okay, let's see. These are great questions. Could you talk about and comment on some of the skills or training that the women on the historical committee had, shared, or sought since their inception?
Sure. So I think in the beginning we do see them like seeking out guidance from like some of them had like Dorothy Davids was faculty at the UW Extension, so she had like some connections to libraries and she knew people who had worked in archives. So I think we do see some initial like there's some people that they are like corresponding with about how to organize this information. However, I will say that their methods of like organizing materials and in making them accessible differs pretty significantly from the way that materials are made accessible in most libraries and archives, and that was intentional. So you know the library is the archive is primarily organized around people. So different people have their own collections, which is not uncommon in other archives, but you really have to know kind of like what people were involved in order to find the things that they were involved in. So for instance, like most of the materials related to the historical committee are in either Dorothy Davids or Bernice Miller's collections. And those are all within like a bunch of different subfolders. And so the way that they kind of organized this right away around people that they deemed important and events that they deemed important is really clear when you look at just like the way that the archive is set up. The other thing that they did right away was they created a catalog of what they had, but they like created all this like commentary on the catalog. Like they would like write these comments like, you know, this source is highly recommended, or like this source is extremely biased, like don't read this, basically. And so you kind of see them right away, like, you know, bringing things together, but also commenting on them. And then you also see really interesting things like, you know, for instance, one of the things in the archive that I talk about in the book is they copied John Sargent Jr.'s journal, who John Sargent Jr. was another missionary that they interacted with. And you'll see in some of these things that like they've created indexes of the journal to say like these are the pages on which Mohican people are mentioned, so that people who, you know, the audience is clearly other tribal members. It's not like it's presented in this way that like, oh, anybody can just come and like, you know, read this for whatever purpose it is. Like it's clearly for tribal members who are interested in their own history. So yeah, I think like they do have like some kind of like minor training in the beginning, but I think they also are just operating on like what they think will work best for their community, and what they think will work best for them, as they are the ones who are like doing a lot of this research and processing the materials.
Thanks. Another question sort of on this topic. What about the younger generation? How are they involved in archiving or education?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the ways that youth in the community are most involved is through oral histories. The Historical Committee takes up several oral history projects across from 1968 through the present, and in each of these, youth are a big part of conducting the interviews, processing the interviews, helping to write the questions. And so I see that as really wanting to like bring younger people into this process of the creation of new sources, that are ultimately going to impact history. I think we also see a lot of engagement with youth on the historical trips. You know, as you saw from the picture that I showed earlier, like there are people as old as like in their mid 80s to as young as, I think the youngest I saw was 4 who went on one of the historical trips. And there are writings from like the journals on the historical trips. The Historical Committee had a lot of foresight, and they handed out journals to everybody who went on these historical trips and asked people to write down their reactions. And so there are just these rich sources for these trips. And a lot of them are from younger people who maybe were in high school or in college, and reflecting on how they are interacting with these places, which I found to be really powerful. And then you also see in the recollections of some of the historical committees from the trip that they are writing about, like, you know, we talked to the younger folks about, you know, how to read a map and how to like look for these things. And so you see them doing kind of like multiple different types of education through those trips.
Awesome, thank you. So there are a couple questions about method here, and kind of thinking about the kind of methods of a traditional historian. I'm going to put that in quotations because I think it could be a baggy category, so we can do whatever we want with that. But like a historian's training, and the training that one would receive in Native Studies, and whether, and then also maybe about the relationship between academia or a kind of public institution, archival institution like the Newberry, and activism, and how, if you see tensions there, and kind of how you navigate those or see people effectively navigating the relationships or tensions among those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the discipline of history, there's a lot of tension in what counts as a source, and how we write history and what our motivations for writing history are. These are debates that are still happening, and have been happening in the last couple of years about, whether oral histories are legitimate sources as opposed to archival documents, whether conversations with community members are legitimate sources as opposed to archival documents. I think there are also continual debates about the level and in which we should be like asking permission from tribes to publish things and working with communities rather than being like a quote unquote neutral party. I think like my general response to that is just that like there's no such thing as a neutral historian. Any historian who comes to a project is always going to have some level of bias and some level of motivation for whatever it is that they are writing about. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that bias historically has been used to write histories that center white people and center and celebrate white people. And so I think that, today, within the discipline of Native Studies, we have to work against the legacies of that disciplinary history where knowledge has been exploited and extracted, and histories have been misrepresented. So I think I see it as a fundamental responsibility of mine as a non-Native scholar to work closely with communities in a way that does not repeat those same processes. I will also just say, as I mentioned earlier, like, I would have gotten so much wrong in this book if I had only looked at the archival materials. And so I just think it's naive to think that you are ever going to get all of the information that you need from archival materials, or that you are like the all-knowing knowledge source that knows how to interpret these archival materials. Because communities will always have knowledge that has been passed down through generations that live outside of these documents. This book would have been a disaster if I had tried to like write it without talking to people about it. So it is ethical to, I think, do scholarship this way, but I also just think it makes for better history. And so, I guess that's what I would say.
So maybe sort of the flip side of that question, I know that the Newberry's Consortium in American Indian and Indigenous Studies, the Summer Institute in Indigenous Studies is happening this month. So there are a number of grad students in the room who are here to be in seminar together. And so I'm kind of thinking about those folks as the next generation of Indigenous Studies scholars who are gonna produce amazing scholarship. And so I'm wondering kind of what you see as the future of Indigenous Studies archival research and scholarship as we kind of look to the future.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that I hope that people take from the book is that tribal archives should become a much bigger part of Native history research. I think right now there are far too few scholars who are engaging with tribal archives and who are working in them. And I think that I hope that people consider making the tribal archive, if there is one, of whatever community they're working with or writing about, like one of, if not the first stop that they go to in their research, because I just think it's incredibly important to make those connections and also just like to understand how that community is representing their own history. So I really hope that becomes like a bigger part of the kind of work that people are doing in the years to come. And I also just think like, we're already seeing this, but I really hope that reciprocity and relationality and responsibility just continue to be central to the methods that really define Native American and Indigenous studies. I think, again, those were clearly very important to me in the book that was written, and I think that they should be important to anybody who is in that next generation.
Thanks. Last question. Could you tell us what's next in terms of what's on the horizon for you?
Yeah. I have been really fortunate for the last 4 years to be working on a multifaceted project that is going to debut in September called Indigenous Chicago, that tells a new story of the history of the city by centering Indigenous perspectives. So I've been really, again, fortunate to work with many colleagues and community members and tribal representatives to co-curate an exhibit that's going to be coming out that's going to open on September 12th, but also build a website, write curriculum, conduct oral histories, and there's going to be some more public programs in the fall as well. So that's really been taking up quite a bit of my time over the last 4 years. But I will say that as part of doing that research, I have become really interested in how the story of Chicago's founding is told. It's become very clear to me in doing a lot of research for the project, as well as one of the goals for the project was sort of to like engage the tourist industry and think about how like the tourist industry here in Chicago is telling stories of Indigenous history or not telling them or telling them badly. And it turns out they're mostly not telling them or telling them really badly. And so, and the fact that just like so much of Indigenous history is like represented in the built environment of Chicago, like in monuments and in different kinds of plaques. And so I've become really interested in just like the difference between how the history of the city is represented in those different ways and the reality from like reading these documents from the 17th to the 19th century. And so I'm lightly interested in kind of like writing a new history of Chicago's founding that sort of goes back to records that a lot of people have read, but read them in a new way to really pull out Indigenous voices and Indigenous presence. I don't exactly know what this is going to look like yet. I need to talk more with the community members who have been working with us on the Indigenous Chicago project and learn a little bit more about their priorities, talk a little bit more about if this is something that is of interest to them. And I don't know if it's just an extension of like the project that we're already working on or if it's a book or if it's an article, but that's kind of what I'm interested in working on next. So
thank you. And thank you all for being here and for the questions.